Well, thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Adam Austerfield. I'm a visiting fellow at the Cañada Blanch Institute at the London School of Economics. This is another online masterclass in social science that we've been delighted to work with the foundation on in recent years through the COVID pandemic. However, our relationship with the foundation goes back to 2012, and we've had many hundreds of students, 700-800 students coming through the foundation here in Madrid. And we've also had many thousands online through these seminars between this terrific relationship between the Fundación Areces and the London School of Economics. And we are enormously grateful to Don Raimundo and the team here at the foundation for supporting this particular program, and looking forward to many more in the future years. So today we're going to be looking at data science as a discipline and in the social sciences, and we have two distinguished faculty members with us today. Professor Patrick Sturgis is a full professor and director of the methodology department at the London School of Economics. He was also director of the ESRC National Centre for Research Methods and president of the European Survey Research Association from 2011 to 2015. He chaired the British Polling Council Market Research Society inquiry into the failure of the 2015 election polls. I remember that very well in the event at the LSE itself. As people said, people were reading the polls, not the politics at the time. And he's also served as a specialist advisor to the House of Lords Select Committee on Polling Data and Digital Media. He's an editorial board member of Public Opinion Quarterly, of Survey Research Methods, and International Journal of Social Research Methods. So Patrick, thank you for joining us today. Patrick also received his PhD from the London School of Economics in social psychology. Dr. Milena Tsvetkova, the LSE Methodology Department. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Methodology, completed her PhD in sociology at Cornell University. And before joining the London School of Economics, she was a postdoctoral researcher in computational social science at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. And Milena's research interests lie in computational experimental social science with a focus on inequality and large social groups. She also works very interestingly across social science and wider research interests, including with computer scientists, physicists, game developers, and looking at large-scale online experiments, providing insights into research. So we are delighted to have you here to look at some of the key issues in data science and its use and application in the social sciences. I've asked Professor Sturgis, first of all, just to give us a bit of background about how the LSE has developed methodology over the last 30 years, and also something about the department's impact and approach when it comes to what is the LSE's motto, which is to know the causes of things, and in my humble opinion, knowing the causes of things needs a good methodology to start with. So we're delighted to have you here, Patrick, and welcome to the Foundation and this program. And perhaps you could introduce the department and some of the background for us today.
Thanks very much, Adam. Yeah, very pleased to be invited along by the Foundation to talk to you about this. We just celebrated, in fact, we had a nice celebration on Friday. Our 30th anniversary of the methodology department. Was initially an institute, and it was set up in 1992 because there was a sort of general recognition at that time across the UK, really, that there were a number of kind of reports and so on being done, that the standard of methodological training was quite weak and patchy, particularly in quantitative methods. And so the school set up the Methodology Institute under the directorship of Professor Colm O'Mercatic. And we started out with, I think, just a couple of courses, really, on quantitative methods and qualitative methods, a few skills-based courses. And they were offered to students in any department. And this kind of model of having a central institute providing methods training proved to be pretty successful, and we kind of it expanded quite incrementally initially, sort of from year to year. We maybe start offering more courses and more students coming to these methods courses, and we grew, we took on more faculty. We started offering some more specialist courses rather than the kind of core training in quant and qual methods, adding research design, and so on. And I think, therefore we're quite a good barometer of sort of changing methodological practice and new areas, because we like to make sure that we're keeping up to date with developments and training our students at LSE in the modern methods that we need to address our kind of policy questions. And around 2017, my predecessor as the head of department, Ken Benoit, started developing some courses, his own research interests and methodological interests very much in data science. So started offering courses, I think initially in quantitative text analysis and then some computer programming type courses. And that really was very, very popular. So there was a lot of demand from students. And so then Ken went on to set up our master's program in applied social data science, and we have then recruited more faculty in what we refer mainly to computational social science rather than data science, because that kind of gives the focus on the kind of the social science applications rather than the sort of broader field of data science. So we've gone from having, I think, sort of zero data science courses to, Milena might be able to correct me here, but I think we've got about 6 now. We have courses in machine learning as well. We have computer programming, data for data scientists, social network analysis, and so on. So that's what we've been doing in the methodology department, and we're still sort of growing somewhat. For the first time this year, we're offering data science courses to undergraduate students at LSE, and we're sort of, I think, monitoring things, see where we go next.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and it is, as many of us know, and many of the foundation have experienced as well, in terms of the application of social science is where the LSE really has great influence, I think, and that's something we'd like to discuss partly today as well, but in the knowledge that in academic circles, moving from an institute to a department is a significant event, let's call it, and so that to me certainly shows the relevance and the impact and importance of exactly this approach for all students across social science research, really, and so I'm delighted to see that that's how things are developing here. I'll ask a couple of questions to both of you, but if I could start with you, Patrick, if I may, building on what you've already said in the introduction. So one of the questions we looked at was is how can the latest methodologies and how can the latest research that you use in using, as you say, computational techniques and the advances in the capacity of computational design of research that would give us much more detail in terms of statistical quality, let's call it. So how is that established to give you much more impact or much more insight into research? And is there a way of then translating that research into what I've called predictive abilities, or is that still something that has a wide variance in terms of how we can take this into social policy, into public policy, from strong methodological basis that you have now abilities to be able to do and the research of the department. So it's about how do we translate that great work into impact in society?
Yeah, I mean, I think before I say that, I should just be clear that my bosses at LSE and Ken won't thank me if I don't mention the Data Science Institute. That's established a few years ago, and Ken Benoit now is the director of that, and that is what the school is how it's kind of organising its research and teaching agenda around data science, and methodology is a member of that. So I should just be clear that that's how we're doing things. So, I mean, I think, my background and my profile is, I don't consider myself a data scientist or a computational social scientist. I am someone who is, I suppose, kind of a more conventional quantitative social scientist. I've always had my, from your the bio that you gave earlier, I'm kind of steeped in survey methods and polling and that sort of thing. And so I've been sort of observing these developments from a slight kind of perspective of detachment and skepticism, I think you might say at times. And so it's been interesting to see these how things have developed in social sciences with data science. And I think my initial sense that there was an awful lot of hype and that there wasn't a great deal that was new has slowly kind of modified to being one that I am actually now seeing really tangible change in social science. Some of this is hard to kind of discern in a precise way because there's so much kind of overlap between what we would now often call data science and what 10 years ago, or some people now would still call statistics. We've always been analysing large data sets using statistical models and so on. So as I say, it's quite hard to put precise boundaries around it. But I think we are really now seeing quite a lot of impact, quite a lot of change on how social science is done, the sorts of data sets that social scientists are using, the sorts of analytical methods that they're using, and the ways of working, I think, has really transformed. And that's been driven broadly by this kind of the influence of computer science, computational social science. So I think that sort of perhaps is more of an influence than what we're seeing in what's being published in the social science journals, in the top journals of the fields and so on. We're perhaps still mostly seeing conventional methods, conventional data, surveys, experiments, field experiments, administrative data and so on. So I think that we're noticing that. We're starting to see more papers being published in those top journals and having a sort of a policy impact that way. But I see the trend and the impact being as much or more so in ways of working. And what I mean by that really is if I think back to how I would do my ways of working as an early career researcher would be to use kind of proprietary statistical software with routines that were kind of built in with various defaults and so on. Using often drop-down menus. You wouldn't kind of record your data flow. You wouldn't share anything with anyone. Once the paper was published, within 5 years, you'd have lost all the data and any code that you used because it would be on some dead hard drive somewhere. And so now that practice has really changed a lot. And certainly the way that we train our students is all about open sharing, replicability, and that is the way that one does that in terms of workflows and sharing things on GitHub and so on, I think is a really important development and change in the way that social science is practiced.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, no, thank you, Patrick. Yeah, so we'll ask Milena. Milena, the same question to you, I think, Milena, sorry. The same question to you, really. I know this is more of your background and your field from the computational side, but again, we're really interested in that side of the equation. And again, a lot about LSE's approach to the quality or evidence-based, dare I say it, in terms of producing information that can be relied on to make decisions, essentially. But from that more technical side, how have you seen the developments of recent years help your particular discipline?
Yeah, thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here. I have this opportunity to spar on with my colleague Patrick Sturgis. So from my perspective, so it is true that social sciences have been a bit of a laggard in this field. So a lot of the developments have started from computer science and, of course, statistics, applied mathematics, and have been applied much more greatly in the natural sciences, such as astronomy, biology. But I think that this is not just a matter of kind of changing how we do methods, how we work together, and also changing the kind of the amount of data we get. There is it is true that now we can handle larger amounts of data, but I think there has been a qualitative change, and this is much less talked about, particularly since kind of the popular term about these changes has been talking about big data. But the fact is that it's not just big data, it's different kinds of data. And so, for example, it is true that now we have census and register data. We can handle these enormous amounts of data. We also have, for example, digitized a lot of historical archives. So as before you would go to the library and do manual research, now you have thousands, hundreds of thousands of books at your disposal. And in a sense, this hasn't kind of really changed how we approach how we do science. But now actually we have new forms of data coming in that require new methods. So for example, surveys continue. Now they have moved online, so not a kind of a qualitative change. But for example, now we're combining survey data with browser tracker data. So for example, tracking what links you click on your browser. We also can combine them with mobile data, so sensors or geolocation, for example, right? Now we have a lot of our social activity being transferred online, so we can track this. They're known as digital trace data, where we can track economic transactions on by online commerce or social media interactions, for example, right? Going even further, scientists have analyzed, for example, surveillance camera recordings. There are actually public surveillance cameras that you can get access to those. Satellite imagery, that's another one, right? So this is completely different kinds of data that we can bring in and apply completely different methods to do that. And so, for example, to mention some of these new methods, one of the field I'm working in is network analysis. And this is a new approach in which we would, instead of looking at individuals as we do in surveys, where we would kind of average their preferences, networks, we focus on interactions between individuals, for example, or between entities such as organizations, right? Text analysis, this enormous amounts of now digitized records. We need very different techniques in which we can analyze text. And of course, there has been a shift from kind of survey data, starting with research questions and kind of answering them via that after collecting data, to data mining, right? So just coming across large amounts of data and starting to find patterns that allow us to make discoveries, in a sense, right? Kind of more data-driven approaches. And there have been, as Patrick said, there have been indeed changes in terms of kind of data sharing, open source software, for example, that allows all kinds of individuals to work with this. But there have been also a lot of other changes in terms of how we work with such large amounts of data. So, for example, cloud computing has been very instrumental in how we store these data, how we share them, how we work. So that's, again, related to this idea that instead of having kind of rooms where we would go and do some data analysis, we can actually now have this distributed computing on the cloud where we can do that. And there have been other changes. For example, crowdsourcing is another enormous area where we would now, instead of having kind of a lab of undergraduate students do some manual labeling, we would actually outsource a lot of research to citizen scientists or individuals who work on online platforms that would contribute to kind of collaborative idea of research. So there have been changes, not just in terms of the amount of data and kind of the scale of the research we do, but I think quite a lot of actually qualitative changes in the new methods we need to apply, the new kinds of data we're dealing with, combining different data sources. And then, of course, as Patrick mentioned, how we actually work together with each other, with government and with the industry and with actually the general public.
I think thank you very much. That's a fascinating insight, really. And as Patrick pointed out earlier on, of course, studying data is what academics have been doing for thousands of years rather than a new discipline. This is something that has always been part, especially at the LSE, in fact, in terms of accessibility to quality data and producing analysis of that data in a structured and in a framework that produces the outputs that give us all signals and insights into what is really going on. Sorry, Patrick. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to come in and slightly respond to some of the things that Milena said, which I agree with. But I think that we're at the stage with social science, with those kinds of data and the wrangling with them and trying to get, is that I published a study last year with Rebecca Luff where we did a content analysis of journal articles, what data they were using in the sort of the top journals, the Economic Review and American Journal of Sociology, going back from 1939 to 2016. And we found that only very small proportion. I mean, this was 6 years ago, and I would expect it to have changed quite a lot already. But even by 2016, we found about 3% of articles in those top journals were using what you might call big data. And I think that isn't to say that people aren't publishing stuff on this, but it's not in the kind of the main disciplinary journals. There's lots of stuff going on in nature, human behavior, science, those kinds of disciplinary journals. But a lot of what that work is doing is grappling with really hard problems with these data. It's thinking about how representative is the data? What is the quality of measurement? What are the kind of ethical issues around using it? So much more complexity in those questions that in social science than there are in other applications of data science. And I'll give you a good example actually from one of my PhD students, Oriol Bosch. He is doing research on using metering devices and sensors in surveys. And this is one of the, I think the areas of great promise if you think about the way that we've traditionally tried to measure things like media consumption, which is to do a big survey and have an interview go around and ask people, how much time do you spend listening to the radio or do you read these newspapers and so on. And of course, that's just doesn't work in the modern, online media environment. It's completely useless for obvious reasons. And so the idea that we can sort of collect people's actual online behavior in real time and link it to a survey is immensely attractive to a social scientist. The idea of zero measurement error, we see exactly what they do. And there's been a lot of excitement around that in survey research and data science and so on. But actually what Oriol's looking at is and other researchers are looking at some of the kind of the problems of doing things in that way. You get better measurements, but how many people are prepared to put a meter on their phone? And if they're looking at things that they might not want people to see that they're doing, which often is what people are doing on the internet. And maybe they'll put it on one device, but not their, I've got some other computers here and a phone. We all have multiple devices. You maybe just put it on one. And so he's looking at the kind of the undercounting, the errors that you get from that and from the sort of the biased samples that you end up with. And so this isn't to say, I don't want to be kind of overly pessimistic about it, but what I'm saying is where we are as a field at the moment is struggling with these very complex issues. I think initially you get this kind of great wave of enthusiasm, possible kind of hubris to some degree, and then people come along afterwards and try and fix these problems. And I think we're still very much grappling with those things, rather than people kind of publishing substantive policy kind of articles about this is the answer to this long-standing question. We're still kind of grappling with how do we do this at this stage.
Yes, I think that was certainly one of the issues I wanted to ask both of you, was about that sort of accessibility to data and some of the interdisciplinary work as well that is undergoing is part of the discipline. Is that if you can combine different data sets, but they will have different sources and they will have different challenges with them. If you're talking about satellite data, whether you're talking about government collected aggregated data that you can then match with other different data sets as well. So my question, I think, is more how do from an academic point of view, how do you establish the relationships with those different data sources that you have a trusted role in analyzing it and taking that data for academic purposes, as it were, if you've got as I say, different sources of data that can be produced or is managed by government entities or private entities or media entities and so on. So how does that combine, and our academics, or is the field able to contain that aggregated data in a way that doesn't have too many errors or too many concerns about it when it's output or analyzed in a certain way?
So I'll jump in. So I mean, I think, the old kind of I guess saying, more data, more problems, right? So now that we have more data, it is true that and a lot of these data are actually quite noisy, right? Especially if we're talking about digital trace data, especially data that is not kind of recorded for purpose, right? So usually it will be data that it's found data that we just have record of, but it's not exactly addressing our research question. So there are a lot of issues with that, right? So it's much less clean than, say, a census, even or survey, despite having all these problems. And it is true that we are having quite a lot of research trying to address these issues. But I think where the power of data science has been, particularly recently, has been in situations where we don't have official data records. It's data that we cannot collect necessarily, or data that lags a lot. So think about, for example, unemployment data or health related to COVID, for example, right? Like records from hospital records about death certificates. So data that lags. The official way of collecting data is much takes much more time. So I think in those cases, actually, these alternative sources of data could be quite helpful. They're not perfect. There have been a lot of issues. So anytime, for example, we have tried to use, say, Google searches for symptoms for disease, it has been found that there is a bit of a kind of a media effect of where if the media reports on, say, flu coming up, people start looking up this, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they have the symptoms. It kind of reinforces the interest in the topic. So there are lots of issues. We're becoming more and more aware of that. But often these kind of data could be much more we can get it immediately and then of course act upon it. So going back to satellite images, for example, so that's another source that has been used to evaluate poverty in third world countries where administrative data is missing. And you could, for example, look at satellite images either at night, so night images in terms of the amount of electricity individuals use, or even during the day in terms of, say, the roof materials they use and so on, to start aggregating this at the level of whole countries and where you could start filling in the gaps of, say, official administrative records. So I think there is, it's not perfect. It's actually quite noisy data. But often it's the best we can do, and there are a lot of efforts in developing techniques and also finding more and original sources of data where we can fill in the gaps.
And is that so? I'll come back to you as well, Patrick. But is that a way of when you're speaking to these sources of data, whether it's private sector, public sector, and so on? What is that discussion like to say, this is going to be a really interesting study, but we need your data from, whether it's from Google, from a private provider, or whether it's from a public sector entity as well? I mean, those discussions presumably are not straightforward, but nonetheless, people see the ability in terms of what the output would be for a kind of, whether it's public good or private good in terms of its utility. How does that work? How can you provide, how can you discuss these issues with someone like Google or other sources of incredible data, but that needs to be analyzed in an academic, with a kind of rigorous academic approach that gives it its best analysis?
Yeah, that's a great question. So unfortunately, there isn't that much kind of a formal way of collaborating with private industry. Now, let's not forget that private companies don't necessarily have public interest. They have their own interest in maximizing profit or stock value or whatever it is. And often the cost of collaborating with academics is more than potentially the benefits. Mm-hmm. And so there have been in the past, at the very beginning, there were a few efforts about that. And over time, usually what happens is that the larger company grows, the more successful it becomes, the less open it is, right? The larger the legal department grows, right? Like the harder it becomes to collaborate with that. And so this unfortunately has really very, very much restricted the kind of research that social scientists have done. So either you have to kind of work in a company such as Facebook or Google, and then with the permission of the legal department, publish out of there, which of course there's a lot of critique from outside in terms of what goes through, right, like the marketing department or the legal department. So obviously, a private company would not be happy about publications that critique how they're handling privacy or algorithms or whatever it is, right? And then on the other hand, academics often use publicly available data. Until recently, that was Twitter. Who knows what's going to happen now with the takeover? But a lot of research has been done with publicly available data, which doesn't mean it's the best data or the most suitable data, but it is the data that we have access to.
And is that, or Patrick as well, is that in the public domain in terms of government data or collected data on citizen participation activity, all sorts of other different areas? That's a different conversation, but equally it's quite difficult to be able to analyze or collate that data as well? Is that the same story? Is it a slightly different process?
Muted. Sorry, I've got a cat wandering around. It's probably start meowing.
Don't worry.
I think that's clearly one of the real challenging parts of this as well. And I think it's often the case, as Milena implied, that academics sometimes have to get involved with some sort of permission gateway, which is very unappealing. If you're working on a paper, you've got the data, and then it has to be signed off by someone in a legal department in a corporation that's very risk averse, and you therefore and so it's a bit of a Wild West in that sense. There isn't the kind of the negotiated framework that you would have in other kind of contexts of getting hold of administrative data from government, for example, which has its own problems. But I think they're in some respects more challenging when you're dealing with a kind of private sector actor. And another issue there, of course, is that you're not really clear what the data is. That is it the full data that you're being given? If you get some data dump from a private company, it's kind of in their interests to weed out anything that they might not want in the public domain before it goes out. There's some kind of, well, it might be actually kind of quite unintentional, some pre-processing decisions that mean that the data that you're getting is missing some key parameters. I've done a lot of work over the years working with the Gamble Aware charity and doing research in sort of problem harmful gambling, and we spent a lot of time getting betting data, electronic, huge databases of betting transactions and stakes and so on, and so that was ultimately successful, and there's been some interesting research to come out of that. But of course, my point is that what we've been given by the gambling companies is just what we've been given. We have no idea what they've done to it really before it gets to us. And that has some real kind of, I think, there are some problematic issues there around what the sort of representativeness of the data is and what the completeness of it, and if it's been kind of passed before analysis.
Milena, would you like to comment from the public side as well as the private?
No, absolutely. So actually, I just wanted to bring in some of my colleagues' research, which I think is really promising, really kind of interesting. And the fact that even though private companies' data is private, and because of terms of service, we as users cannot access it. Even actually, if we can technically access it, we cannot do research with it. However, the fact is that these are data that the company uses already to feed us back the product that they're doing, right? So we're talking about algorithms they're using, where they would make recommendations or where they would target advertising and so on, right? There have been a bunch of scandals about this, and definitely A/B testing, right? That's another aspect of where companies would be doing experiments on us without our knowledge. So in a sense, these data are already done for research, but it's private research, right? It's research for the purposes of the service that you're getting. And I just wanted to bring in some work from some of my colleagues, particularly Anja Hanak at the University of Zurich, and also people from Northeastern University in Boston, where they would do what is known as algorithmic auditing, of where they would attempt to, essentially they break the terms of service, of where they would make repeated queries of services such as, for example, Google search or some other websites that provide, for example, platforms for hiring workers or offering labor. And they would essentially try to reverse engineer what kind of data and what kind of algorithms the company uses to make their recommendations or predictions or return research results. Right, so there have been actually lawsuits about this in terms of course, if they break in terms of service, so then this is kind of against the rules. But on the other hand, they're doing this in the name of public interest, right? So private companies have private data. They do research with that. They don't publish, right? And especially even if an outside academic has done this research, doesn't mean that the findings find their way into the public sphere, because they might be quite disadvantageous. But on the other hand, right, these private companies have a huge public impact. And companies like Facebook, Google, right, like these are services that a lot of us use on a daily basis, and it have a huge kind of public impact without the accountability and the responsibility. And so there is this mismatch between academics, which most of us like to think of us as doing research in the name of public interest, but not having access and not being able to audit or to even understand what's happening behind these gates. Yet what is happening is actually affecting all of us and has a huge public impact.
It does. No, it's a fascinating discussion and dynamic. I think that I know that in my experience as well at the LSE that is one of the critical questions, that it is hard to persuade many of those sources of data that this is a good exercise to be done properly. Often when the results do come out, if it's certainly some of the government departments that are more trying to introduce this discipline into their own policy making, that they have more interest as well. Some more enlightened members of government can sometimes see that and sometimes not, depending on what the outputs or the impact might be. But I wanted to come back to that sort of political arena as well, Patrick, in terms of some of the work that you've been doing in polling and researching in polling. Do you feel that from a methodological and data science perspective has advanced significantly in recent years because of the approach, as you say, and the sophistication and robustness of the methodology that's applied to that area of data science in terms of polling and the outputs? And perhaps you could give us some insights into some of the recent changes that have happened in that area.
Yeah, well, actually, I think that what Milena sort of introduced there is some really, really fascinating and useful research about sort of algorithmic bias and how sort of reverse engineering what the social media companies are doing and challenging them on that. But that's and there's a whole kind of area of research in sort of online behavior, social media use, and so on, which is about studying that as the site of interest. What are people doing online, and how are they interacting with algorithms and so on, which is inherently interesting. So much of life is online now. But there's also another kind of big area of sort of computational social science, which is in effect trying to use these new forms of data to answer questions about populations and about human behaviour that in the past, and as we still do, we'd be using polls and surveys and field experiments and so on. And I think that is perhaps more challenging, that latter sort of model of doing things. And polling is maybe a good example where we have been doing polls going back to the early 19th century in broadly the same way. People kind of get, in fact, I'm talking on Wednesday at an event organised by the British Polling Council, which is about, can we trust the polls when there's a next election? We always ask this question. The kind of the underlying methodology has always pretty much been the same. You get a sample of people, you make them look like the population in terms of certain characteristics, and you ask them who they're going to vote for. and it works pretty well. I think, you know, we thought that Lula was going to win in Brazil. He just about did. Yesterday, the polls kind of got that more or less right. They knew it was going to be close. We back in 2015, we got it wrong. But so there were often, when the social media potential of this came along, there was quite a lot of excitement, because it doesn't suffer from the same sorts of biases that we worry about with surveys. You know, asking people questions that they might not give you an accurate answer to. You're observing people kind of just talking naturally on Twitter. You know, so it has that attractive function, or that attractive characteristic to it, and people have tried to do this, have tried to use what the sentiment analysis of tweets and so on to try and get a sense, but it hasn't been very successful. There have been some interesting papers on it, and broadly they don't do anywhere near as well as the polls. And so I think, you know, we're going to carry on using polling methodology, online polls, and different from how they were done in the past, very different in terms of the implementation of them. But when you're wanting to ask, when you're wanting to know what's going on inside people's heads, what are you thinking about? What is your attitude to this? Analysing social media data doesn't really get you very close to the answer there. So I think that there are sort of limitations to what you can do with any method, you know, and so doing surveys and so on, as we've said, that just can't get you the answer to some of the questions that we need to answer now. We do need these new forms of data to answer many of the questions, but likewise, the new forms of data can't answer some of the questions that we need to answer in social science.
And is that just staying on that polling question, when we're often presented with, you know, a poll of polls, or, you know, the difference between different polling methodologies or institutions, which in theory are objective, why do we get often quite a discrepancy, or just a number of different data outputs from those polling organizations that, whether they have a political bias or not, in theory have a reasonably robust research or methodology that can give quite a big, several percentage points at least in terms of difference of opinion?
Well, I think we'd need a whole different new seminar on that one, Adam. I think if we were going to get into the sure. sort of polling errors, but you know, there are many decisions that have to be made when you are, you know, making an estimate from a poll, and how you collect data and so on. I mean, there's been some quite kind of interesting studies where exactly the same data set was given to 3 different very highly qualified teams, and saying exactly the same data, give us an estimate of what the current vote intention is, and they each came up with slightly different answers, even though they've got exactly the same data and they're all experts. So that there are always decisions that you have to make about what to do with people who say they don't know, who's going to turn out, how do you weight the data, and all those kinds of things. Which again, I mean, that applies equally if you're not using traditional polling data, but you're using something that you've scraped from Twitter or Facebook or Reddit or whatever. It's not as if you just kind of scrape your data and put it through your sausage machine, there's the answer. There has to be a whole, a large amount of interpretation and decisions about how you chop the data and present it. So that's why you get, you know, always not sort of single answer, but quite a lot of variability.
No, thank you. And I wanted to move on to another area, really, about we've looked in that terrific discussion about, you know, the sources of data, the analytical frameworks, and the methodology that you've been using to do that research and so on. And I wanted to think about or consider what we touched on in the introduction was about, is there demand and interest from a public policy point of view of taking the outputs and using that to help shape and evolve public policy as well, from that evidence base that you're able to produce? Is that something where there is the gap is closing a bit between academia and policy, where the impact of the output is becoming tangible in that sense, to both of you?
I can jump in. So so I think there's a gap still, right? And I think maybe I'll use the kind of the COVID situation as an example, right? So that was a situation where we had kind of unprecedented reporting, right, of individuals using apps to report their symptoms. There were methods where were collected, for example, stool samples from the canalization to test the prevalence of disease in the population, right? There were hospitals, massive reporting, and multiple scientists doing research, right? And this was quite useful because of, for example, allowing just kind of quick data coming on a daily basis, allowing to calibrate the prediction models for the development of the disease, the spread of the disease in real time, pretty much, right? Like, so that was that. And yet, right, there was a very obvious, I think, kind of mismatch of what, say, scientific predictions were versus, right, like policy. So there is, and I think this gap, regardless of what your data source is, whether we're talking about traditional data sources or newer ones, there is not, the gap will be always there, right? Like that, you could have this kind of, belief in more scientocratic, approach to policymaking, of where you could either base decisions on evidence, or alternatively, as what, for example, the Behavioral Insights Unit has been doing, is that you could use kind of A/B testing, right? So you could kind of roll out potentially more questionable programs, public policy programs, randomize individuals at them, and then evaluate the effects, right? So that would be kind of the ideal scientific approach to this. And yet, right, there is a mismatch between that and what political interests might be into, what kind of potentially normative arguments could be arguing for, and so on. So I think that in a sense, the new data is not really helping address that problem. We're just having the kind of old problems now at a much larger scale, and much less kind of excuse for relying on evidence, or rather avoiding the evidence when making policy decisions.
Sure. Patrick, over to you. Is that something also you've experienced? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, this is where you start getting to this issue about sort of definitional boundaries and, what do we mean by data science or computational social science in a policy context. I think that sort of policymakers are probably relatively ambivalent about what we label the kind of research that we do, whether we're using machine learning or logistic regression or whatever, is that they're interested in the findings and the robustness of the evidence and so on. And so I think, we are seeing more, input from what I think you would call computational social science, but probably there are still those kind of reservations about the robustness and quality of the the data that's is underlying it and so on. So I think it's hard to discern a real big kind of shift in that sense in terms of the kind of the social science input to policy making. I don't think we've necessarily seen a substantial shift towards more computational approaches. But another thing that's important to recognise as well in the sort of policy context is the big input that the social sciences can have in terms of the kind of the ethics broadly, and the public acceptability of different of the whole field of data science and algorithms and AI and so on, which are increasingly prevalent in people's lives in ways that they often don't understand or are not aware of. And so social scientists have a big role and are playing a big role in providing that evidence. I'm working on a project at the moment with the Alan Turing Institute and the Ada Lovelace Institute, where we're doing a big survey of kind of public attitudes to artificial intelligence. It's quite a hard thing to ask people about because artificial intelligence often doesn't mean much to people. But those kinds of findings we're hoping will have an impact in terms of how government goes about regulating things and what is permitted and what isn't, having a sense of what the public think about things, and more broadly, what are how do we manage the data that we acquire in different ways, and is that ethically acceptable, and so on. So that's a very big area where social science is having an important policy impact around this kind of area of data science.
Thank you. And that was, in fact, very much one of the subjects of a previous session we've had with the Foundation here with a couple of colleagues at the LSE, and about regulating AI, or regulating, how does one regulate that kind of sector, as it were, where the online world is consistently under surveillance, and the knowledge of people that their data is being used and manipulated in certain ways is very limited. And how does one control that was exactly in that field, I think, and a very important topic for all of us to understand, and let alone consider the policy responses, I think. I'm conscious of the time, but I wanted to ask you both perhaps some of the thoughts you have for the next steps in your field and discipline. Can you see advances coming? Are those perhaps based on the computational discussion we had before, or is this really about, as you said before, Patrick, this is about the approach and the methodology of this could give us much better quality data? So in the field of the research, can you see progress in the next few years that would give us more outputs that could inform us more about these particular areas that are of great public interest, I think, if it can be presented in a way that can be communicated and understood in the public domain? So are there advances you're hoping to see and working on yourselves in that field?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, Milena and I are methodologists. We're in the methodology department, so all these problems are grist to our mill. I think there's an enormous research agenda. The vast arrays of different kinds of data, new types of data emerging all the time, and what we can do with it. What are the kind of quality issues? How do we, So I think there's still, in my view, there's still some distance to go until we are seeing a real shift in the kind of the substantive social science kind of policy impact stuff, where we are routinely using these data to answer questions. I think we're still, for the next 5 years or so, we're going to see more of those papers and more of those kind of bits of research that are telling and have a clear sort of policy read. But I think there's an enormous amount of work that we need to do to understand how. I mean, actually, I'll leave it to Milena. She's doing a really fascinating piece of work with one of our research students, Juan Mohey, looking at how one of the problems with a lot of social media data, Twitter in particular, is you've got lots of information about what they're tweeting, but you know very little about that individual tweeter. And we often really need that information. We need to know, is this person sort of higher or lower educated? What are their consumption patterns? What are their social class, and so on. So that's a nice example of the sorts of things that we need to be able to do better, and the methodological leaps that we need to make so that this is the sort of mainstay of social science. Mm.
So I generally agree with this, and I think that also with some of the critique that Patrick mentioned before, this idea that we're still in this period. I mean, I think we're transitioning from the initial period of kind of excitement and kind of unquestionable lack of critique about finding new data sources, correlating X and Y, and plotting a lovely relationship and publishing a paper about. I think data science is becoming much more kind of critical of itself in terms of the kind of the measures, the methods, the reliability, the robustness of the findings, also kind of the effect sizes, right? That's also the problem with with large data is that you always find a pattern, but kind of putting this in context, to what extent this is meaningful, to what extent it's actionable, does it worth doing anything about this, right? It's kind of there is this next level of critique that we are just, I think, entering. We're also entering and not just kind of focusing on robustness and better methods, better kind of sampling or representativeness of the data, but we also now talking a bit more about explainability, a bit more about causality, for example. So establishing, going back to LSE's motto, but looking at causal relationships, not just looking at patterns without getting deeper. And so I think that this is the direction of where this is all going, improving the methods, being more critical. Also, another big realm that we mentioned was the kind of algorithmic bias and the fact that there is actually an inherent problem with relying on data to make policy making, the idea that you can actually reinforce existing biases in the population. So this is a huge area now of research of how we can account and kind of change the predictions of an algorithm to control for or to counteract potential unintentional biases in particular, not to even mention the intentional ones, of where, for example, people of color or low socioeconomic status individuals would keep on getting kind of less chances because of algorithms learning from data. That's what has been happening in the past. Right. So I'm optimistic overall. I think also social scientists entering a bit deeper into this field that has been kind of mainly initiated by computer scientists. I think we have a lot to contribute. And not just kind of a lot of what happens is computer scientists would use very impressive amounts of data to find something that has been discussed for like centuries in social science, right? So in a sense, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to, just because you find a common knowledge on a whole population level instead of say a lab experiment, it doesn't necessarily make it more valuable. But I think with more introduction of social scientists, with more also self-reflection, there would be potential for a real shift in how we do data science and real kind of also hopefully also impact eventually.
Well, thank you both. We're just about out of time, so I'm going to pull that to a close, but thank you so much for that fascinating discussion. Thank you for taking part with the Foundation today. It's been hugely informative, and I'm always happy to end on an optimistic note, as you said, Milena, for the future of that discipline, and as always, being an integral part, a departmental part of the approach to social sciences that the LSE undertakes, and training the future social scientists and academics and policymakers and business people that happens at the LSE through the teaching and research that you do. So thank you so much for your insights. Congratulations to the department and the Institute for 30 years of advancing the discipline and the social science research that you do, and here's to the next 30 years, I'm sure, in the discipline that will be equally impressive. But thank you very much indeed for joining us today at the Foundation.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.